Okay, let's unpack this fascinating figure who truly gave the world a single universal language for understanding, well, pretty much every story ever told,
Right.
from ancient myths carved in stone to, the blockbusters playing at your local cinema tonight.
Exactly.
We are diving deep today into the life and the monumental legacy of American mythologist Joseph Campbell.
Campbell, who lived from 1904 to 1987, was not just a scholar. I mean, that's the first thing to get. He was the ultimate
A
synthesis.
synthesist, I like
He
that.
created this kind of conceptual bridge between the densest, most ancient texts, world religions, and modern psychology. His body of work is it's incredibly expansive. It addresses nearly every fundamental aspect of the human condition.
And the common threads that bind us all together.
That's it.
That's the essence of his influence, isn't it? I mean, he was a professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College, but his theories they stretched so far beyond those academic walls.
Oh, complete.
They went straight into Hollywood, into songwriting, into motivational speaking. You literally cannot discuss storytelling in the last 50 years without, invoking his name.
And the reason for that ubiquity, that the pervasive influence, is his core theory, the monomyth.
The famous hero with 1,000 faces.
Mm.
The idea that beneath all the surface variety, the localized flair and the cultural specifics of thousands of global myths, there is one profound universal narrative structure.
The journey of the archetypal hero.
It's like the skeleton key to human narrative.
It is. It suggests that all of us, across time and geography, are just telling and retelling the same necessary story over and over again.
So for you, the listener, this deep dive is going to be pretty comprehensive. We're going to trace the rigorous academic and personal journey that led Campbell to this theory.
We'll detail the specific components of the monomyth, break down the 4 essential functions and 4 evolutionary stages of myth, and then, and this is important, we have to tackle the intense academic debates that still surround his impact.
Oh, absolutely. And we absolutely must talk about the maxim that defined him for millions, that philosophy often distilled into just 4 famous words.
Follow your bliss.
Exactly. We'll trace that phrase back to its Sanskrit roots and explain why, later in life, the man who coined it sometimes felt he needed to backtrack on it just a little.
It's a journey from intellectual monasticism to pop culture icon. It's a rich, complex story that is, in and of itself, a kind of hero's journey.
To understand the man who systematized the world's myths, we really have to look at his origin story. And it has some genuinely unexpected beginnings. Joseph John Campbell was born in 1904, and he was raised in an upper-middle-class Irish Catholic family in New York.
And his early path suggests a very analytical mind. He initially studied biology and mathematics at Dartmouth College.
Right, which is such a fundamentally rational scientific start.
It is, especially for a future mythologist who would be labeled by some critics as, anti-science.
It really is, and it speaks to the necessary discipline he had. But he quickly realized his true passion was in the humanities. He transferred to Columbia University.
Right.
He earned his BA in English literature in 1925, and then his MA in medieval literature in 1927.
And just to add another layer to confirm the sheer physical and mental energy this guy had, he was also a stellar athlete at Dartmouth.
I read that. He was among the fastest half-mile runners in the world at one point.
In the world. That combination of, physical discipline and intense intellectual curiosity is so crucial. It hints at the level of rigor he would apply to his later independent studies.
And that key turning point, the thing that set his philosophical compass, came in 1924 when he was sailing back from Europe.
Yes, the encounter on the ship.
He had a defining meeting with Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was the designated messiah of the Theosophical Society at the time.
And that meeting just sparked this profound, lasting interest in Hindu and Indian philosophy. It pulled his focus away from purely Western literature and medieval history, and it set him on this, global comparative path.
So armed with a Columbia Fellowship, he goes back to Europe between 1927 and 1929. He's studying Old French, Provençal, and Sanskrit in Paris and Munich.
He mastered French and German. He was immersing himself in the deepest linguistic roots of both Western and non-Western thought.
But then came the crucial crossroads, the refusal of the call moment, if you want to use his own terms.
That's a great way to put it.
When he returned to Columbia in 1929, he wanted to fuse his medieval studies with his new interests in Sanskrit and modern art.
And the faculty they rejected it. They couldn't reconcile these, disparate disciplines under one academic roof. They didn't have a box for it.
So Campbell, rather than conforming or compromising his vision, he walked away.
He walked away from his doctoral studies. He rejected the rigid academic structure that couldn't accommodate his comparative approach.
And this wasn't some bitter retreat, was it? It was more like an affirmation of his own independence.
Absolutely. Later in life, he famously joked that earning a PhD in the liberal arts was a sign of incompetence.
Wow.
He was asserting that the boundaries that specialists erect are often the very walls that prevent true synthesis.
And what he did next is, it's just legendary, especially for anyone who loves the idea of deep self-directed learning.
The Great Depression arrives, and it provides the perfect setting for his own personal intellectual initiation journey.
Between 1929 and 1934, Campbell spent 5 consecutive years living in near isolation.
In a rented shack in Woodstock, New York.
Right. This was a period of deliberate, intensive, and incredibly rigorous independent study. He was, quite literally, building the intellectual foundation for the hero with 1,000 faces.
And here's the nugget, the detail that speaks to the sheer force of will involved.
Yeah.
Campbell didn't just read. He had this staggering, almost monastic schedule.
He divided his day into 4 3-hour periods.
Right. And he dedicated 3 of those blocks, 9 hours, entirely to reading and note-taking.
9 hours every single day for 5 straight years.
Just think about that commitment. That is the engine that powered his comprehensive knowledge of global mythology, anthropology, psychology. A knowledge so vast, it allowed him to pull together patterns across these huge distances of time and culture.
That kind of rigor is just astonishing. It's what allowed him to become the expert, even outside of the formal academic structures that, had rejected him.
And while he was doing that intense study, he also cultivated some really influential friendships.
He traveled to California for a year in the early 1930s.
Where he befriended the budding writer John Steinbeck.
And critically, he became extremely close with the marine biologist Ed Ricketts.
The real-life model for Doc in Steinbeck's Cannery Row.
Exactly. Campbell actually lived next door to Ricketts for a time. And what's fascinating about that relationship is that Ricketts was already writing these philosophical essays about the nature of life.
And Campbell saw the connection. Campbell recognized patterns in Ricketts' philosophical observations that mirrored his own emerging hero's journey thinking.
So the journey wasn't just in the ancient texts. It was in the philosophical underpinnings of modern biology and ecology, too. He saw the pattern in the tide pool as much as in the Upanishads.
Absolutely. This grounding in biology, literature, philosophy, it all provided the necessary framework. He eventually did return to teaching, accepting a professor of literature position at Sarah Lawrence College in 1934.
And he taught there for 38 years until 1972.
In 1938, he married a former student, the accomplished dancer and choreographer Jean Erdman. Their shared life in this modest 2-room apartment in Greenwich Village was this ongoing blend of high art, literature, and intellectual pursuits for nearly 5 decades.
Now, a key intellectual friendship that really shifted his focus toward Asian mythology happened during World War II.
Yes, with the Indologist Heinrich Zimmer.
When Zimmer died suddenly, Campbell was entrusted with this monumental task of editing and posthumously publishing Zimmer's voluminous papers.
And this was not a quick job. This preparation forced Campbell to immerse himself in Indology, the study of Indian cultures, languages, and literature, for over a decade.
Right. And when the final volume of Zimmer's work, The Art of Indian Asia, was ready for publication in 1955, Campbell took a sabbatical.
And this led to his first and deeply impactful trip to Asia.
He spent a year there, 6 months in southern Asia, mostly India, and 6 months in East Asia, mainly Japan. He even kept journals, which were later published.
And that year just profoundly solidified his views. Seeing the living traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism in action, rather than just reading about them in a book, was the final catalyst.
It convinced him he needed to teach comparative mythology not just to students in a college lecture hall, but to a wider, global, non-academic audience.
Exactly. His true work, in a way, began after his retirement in 1972, when he began writing and lecturing almost full-time.
All right, let's get into the engine room, how he actually built the theory of the monomyth. Campbell didn't work in a vacuum. His work sits squarely at the crossroads of literary criticism, philosophy, and depth psychology.
And what's truly fascinating is his intellectual lineage. On the literature and philosophy side, he drew so heavily from the German tradition. You've got Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche.
He also corresponded with Thomas Mann, right?
He did. He recognized their shared fascination with mythic structure. But the James Joyce connection is just It's paramount.
He borrowed the very term monomyth directly from Joyce's notoriously complex final text, Finnegan's Wake.
Yes.
Wait a minute, though. If he's taking a term like monomyth from Joyce, who is a literary artist focused on subjective experience, isn't that inherently less rigorous than, say, a strict anthropological classification?
That's a brilliant point. I mean, it cuts right to the heart of the critique he would later face. Campbell saw myth as poetry before he saw it as history or sociology. That's Joyce's use of language and this layering of symbolic meaning. It validated Campbell's literary approach to ancient texts. He believed that artistic intuition often gets to the truth faster than the scientific method can.
That makes a lot of sense. It really highlights his core approach. Start with the art, then backfill with the science. Now, moving to the psychological side, while he was influenced by Freud, he leaned much more heavily on Carl Jung and his theories of archetypes.
Absolutely. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, these inherited universal patterns that structure the human mind, that provided the psychological scaffolding for the universal hero.
So he would use Jungian terms.
All the time. He used terms like anima, animus, and ego consciousness to describe the internal battles the mythological hero has to undertake.
And Jung's own insights into those universal archetypes were profoundly influenced by non-Western texts, specifically the Bardo Thodol.
Or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Yes, that's key. The Bardo Thodol is basically a guide to consciousness during the intermediate state between death and rebirth.
So for Jung,
it was a precise cartography of the psyche, navigating this tremendous transition, terror, and potential enlightenment. It was a perfect parallel for the hero who must die to their old self to be reborn anew.
we also have to mention the anthropological debt, specifically to German scholars like Leo Frobenius and his disciple Adolf Eligard Jensen.
Their work helped Campbell distinguish between what they called folk ideas, the thousands of local specific ways a story is told, and the elementary ideas, which is the underlying universal prime matter of the monomyth itself.
So his job was to filter out the folk ideas to reveal the elementary pattern underneath.
That was the goal. So if we synthesize all of this, the monomyth is the theory that all great mythic narratives are just variations of a single great story, regardless of their origin or time.
And that central pattern, which he detailed in his 1949 masterpiece, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is the hero's journey: separation, initiation, and return. Now, the ultimate goal of this journey, in Campbell's view, is it's profound. He said it's to make the world transparent to transcendence.
That's the phrase.
It sounds beautiful, but what does that actually mean in practical terms for you listening?
It means that the myth allows you to see through the material world, the world of phenomena, time, suffering, and death, to perceive an eternal, changeless source that is constantly pouring its energy into existence.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of it this way. When you look at a sunrise, the myth doesn't just tell you that is the sun. It tells you that is the constant, eternal source of light and life speaking to me now.
So the hero's journey isn't just an external adventure, it's the internal narrative structure for that revelation.
Precisely. It's the story of an individual who achieves an experience of the eternal source, usually through great suffering or a tremendous effort, and then returns to society bearing some kind of knowledge or insight or gift powerful enough to set society free.
And he always said that return is the hardest part.
The hardest part.
Let's touch on a few of the classic stages he used to classify this story structure, because this is where the theory becomes so immediately applicable to writers. It often begins with the call to adventure.
Right, the disruption of the ordinary world. But often, the first major step is the refusal of the call.
Right.
This is critical psychologically. The hero hesitates because stepping into the unknown means dying to their current identity. Think of the psychological weight of leaving your comfort zone or quitting a job that pays well but kills your spirit. That's the refusal.
If they accept, they cross the threshold, often aided by a mentor or some kind of supernatural aid, and then they enter the road of trials.
The tests, the allies, the enemies, these trials lead to the climactic moments deep within the belly of the whale. The meeting with the goddess, which often represents unconditional love.
And the atonement with the Father.
Confronting the highest power and resolving the primary conflict. The ultimate reward, the elixir, is gained there.
And then the final phase,
Right.
the return. But often there's another refusal, the refusal of the return.
Yes, because the hero is so enlightened or comfortable in the transcendent world, they don't want to come back to the mundane. That refusal is deeply symbolic. Knowledge gained in the depths often feels, well, incommunicable.
So the hero has to be compelled to come back.
Sometimes violently. The magic flight or the rescue from without to bring the gift back to humanity, completing the circuit.
That deep dive into the specific stages shows us the monomyth isn't just a literary template, it's a manual for psychological transformation.
Right.
But this brings us back to Campbell's crucial insistence that myths must be interpreted as metaphor, not as fact, not as history, not as science.
He was so emphatic on this point. He recognized that the power of myth lies in its symbolic resonance, not its literal truth. He said the moment the poetry of myth is interpreted as biography or science, it's killed.
The living, metaphorical images become remote facts. The link between the inner and outer world just dissolves.
And he gave us such a powerful, clear quote on this difference in that 1987 documentary, Joseph Campbell, A Hero's Journey, about the nature of God itself.
I remember this.
Yeah. He explained that God is a metaphor for a mystery that absolutely transcends all human categories of thought, including being and non-being.
And then he drew this sharp distinction between the two groups of people who misinterpret this.
Theists, he said, are religious people who think their metaphors are facts.
Okay.
Atheists, on the other hand, know those metaphors are not facts, and therefore they conclude they are lies.
So the key isn't the belief itself, but the act of misinterpreting the belief. For Campbell, both the fundamentalist theist and the militant atheist are making the exact same fundamental error.
Mistaking the map for the territory.
Exactly.
If the metaphor isn't connecting you to the mystery, if it isn't giving you that sense of transcendence, then it has failed its primary function. It has become a lie, regardless of whether you believe it literally or reject it completely.
Now we shift from the universal shape of the story, the monomyth, to the universal job or purpose the story serves in society. Campbell argued that mythology serves a fourfold function.
A structure he laid out most explicitly in works like The Masks of God, creative mythology.
And these functions explain why myths emerge and why they persist.
The first, and in Campbell's view, the most crucial one, is the mystical or metaphysical function.
This is the spiritual high point, right? It's about awakening and maintaining in the individual a sense of awe and gratitude before the mystery of being itself.
Exactly. This function reconciles our rational, waking consciousness to the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the tremendous and fascinating mystery of this universe as it is, vast, beautiful, and terrifying all at once.
Mythological symbols, when enacted through ritual, bypass the intellect
and directly exhilarate centers of life beyond the reach of reason.
The second function is more practical, the cosmological function. This is where myth acts as a proto-science, explaining the shape and mechanics of the universe.
Correct. For pre-modern societies, before modern science, myth offered the essential explanations for physical phenomena. Why do the seasons change? Why does the sun move? Where does the rain come from? It provided the framework necessary for survival.
The third is the sociological function, validating and supporting the existing social order. Myth as social glue.
Right, the rules. Myth is often used to hold communities together, enforcing the necessary conformity for survival. And this is where Campbell introduces a really vital distinction.
The two paths.
The conformity myths, the ones that affirm the prevailing customs, laws, and hierarchies, he called the right-hand path. This path relies heavily on logic, order, and social adherence.
But then there's this vital subversive contrast, the left-hand path. How is that different, and why is the hero's journey often considered a left-hand path story?
Well, the left-hand path involves mythic patterns that are inherently revolutionary. They demand that the individual surpass social norms and sometimes even conventional morality in pursuit of a higher personal truth.
Like Prometheus stealing fire.
Exactly. Or Christ rejecting the established religious and political order. These myths break conformity. They prioritize the individual's spiritual breakthrough over maintaining the established societal structure.
And the hero's journey, which requires the individual to leave the village and return changed, is fundamentally a left-hand path pattern.
So society needs the right-hand path for stability, but it needs the left-hand path for evolution and spiritual renewal. It's fantastic structural tension.
It is. And finally, the fourth is the pedagogical or psychological function, focused purely on the individual's internal life.
This function acts as the internal roadmap. As a person grows and inevitably encounters psychological challenges, leaving home, facing mortality, finding a partner myth serves as a guide for successful passage through those life stages.
But Campbell didn't stop at functions. He also showed how mythologies evolve over time, reflecting changing cultural realities. This forms the basis of his massive, unfinished masterwork, Historical Atlas of World Mythology.
And this describes 4 evolutionary stages, or ways.
The earliest stage reflects nomadic hunting and gathering societies. He called it the way of the animal powers.
Right. The worldview is animistic. All of nature, rocks, trees, and especially animals, is infused with spirit.
So the mythological focus centered on the main hunting animal, the source of life. The buffalo, the reindeer, the eland.
And the primary tension was reconciling the necessity to kill the animal with the recognition of its divinity. The myths had to solve that problem.
And they resolved this by presenting the animals not as victims, but as willing victims.
Exactly. The rituals ensure the animal's life would be restored to an eternal, archetypal source. The act of slaughter became a ritual of equal participation between animal and mankind, not a brutal act of mastery.
He used the Blackfoot story of the buffalo's wife as a classic example.
A perfect example. The chief's daughter agrees to marry the buffalo chief to save her starving tribe. Through this union, she is taught the sacred buffalo dance, which is the ritual through which the spirits of the slain animals return to their life source, ensuring the herds replenish.
So next, the shift to agriculture brought a radical change in worldview. This is the way of the seeded earth.
The earth became the mother, and the core myths centered on her life-giving powers and the cycle of cultivation. The essential theme shifted from the spontaneous appearance of animals to repetitive rhythm.
The seasons, the crops, the moon phases.
Right. And the central figures become the female great goddess, Mother Earth, and her ever-dying and ever-resurrected son or consort.
This gave the goddess a crucial dual aspect. She was the giver of life, the bountiful mother.
But also the fierce destroyer who reclaimed life in the harvest.
The rituals were often intense, sometimes including symbolic or even literal human sacrifice, mirroring the cycle of the seed dying in the ground to bring forth new life.
And Campbell argued this cosmology didn't disappear. It persists. He connected this directly to the Christian mysteries. Think of the Eucharist, where bread and wine incarnate the body and blood of Jesus. It carries that same theme.
Sacrifice, death, and resurrection linked to agricultural staples.
And he also linked it to the Greek mysteries of Eleusis, where the journey of Demeter searching for her daughter Persephone in the underworld was enacted. The ultimate reveal during that ritual was not a god, but the wheat stalk.
The symbol of the enduring cycle.
A cycle of life, death, and rebirth tied to the harvest.
With the rise of the first high civilizations in Mesopotamia and Babylonia, the focus shifted again, dramatically, upward to the cosmos. This is the way of the celestialites.
Yes, observation of the stars led to the idea of a mathematically predetermined mechanical universe, a clockwork cosmos. Life on Earth, therefore, had to follow the same rigid, predictable patterns.
The individual became a tiny, predetermined participant in a grand cosmic play.
Politically, this was reflected in the ruler. The king symbolized the sun, the golden crown, the centralized order. The court represented the orbiting planets. The mother goddess was often retained, but she was now fixed, often subjugated, within this new rigid framework.
And then came the shift toward a purely masculine, patriarchal, monotheistic worldview.
Accelerated by external factors. You have Indo-European peoples, or Aryans, descending from the north, and Semites, sweeping up from the Arabian desert. They brought with them male-dominated mythology centered on a warrior thunder god.
And this shift wasn't purely philosophical, it was also technological. These conquering groups often had superior ironsmithing, giving their thunder gods a literal edge.
This led to cultural fusion. Greek, Indian, and Persian mythologies resulted from this blend. Zeus and Indra are warrior thunder gods ascending the throne. But the focus shifted heavily toward the masculine order. The female elements were marginalized.
You see this in the biblical imagery he analyzed. Campbell believed Eve and the snake were once fertility gods, and the tree of knowledge was once the tree of life.
Appropriated and inverted by the new mythos. And this cultural clash is perfectly illustrated in the story of Cain and Abel.
Cain, the farmer whose agrarian offering God rejects.
Versus Abel, the herder whose animal sacrifice is accepted. This wasn't just a simple morality tale for Campbell. It was a perfect mythological reflection of the historical power shift from older agrarian cultures to the newer, more nomadic, pastoral cultures that dominated the Near East.
The final stage brings us closest to the modern world, focusing on the emergence of the individual psychological journey, the way of man.
Campbell saw the poetic form of courtly love, carried by the troubadours in medieval Europe, as a complete new mythology. It introduced the revolutionary concept of person-to-person, erotic experience, the idea of falling in love.
This was a radical break from the communal agape of Christianity or the purely physical eros of the ancient world.
And the legend of Tristan and Isolde serves as the archetypal story for this profound shift. It mythologically sanctioned the transition from the arranged marriage, the social contract, to the modern concept of marriage based on individual, passionate love.
And crucially, a mythological theme eventually became a social reality. The myth preceded the social change.
And Campbell argued that in the modern world, the function once served by these traditional systems is now taken on by individual creators, artists, and philosophers.
James Joyce, Pablo Picasso, Thomas Mann, they become the new myth makers,
Providing the necessary psychological guidance that traditional mythology once offered, but filtered through the lens of the individual mind. Ultimately, for Campbell, all the world religions and mythic cycles are simply culturally influenced masks of the same fundamental transcendent truths.
He summarized this entire structure by quoting the Rig Veda.
Truth is one, the sages speak of it by many names. That single line encapsulates his entire comparative mission.
Campbell died in 1987, but his theories achieved their widest recognition only after his death. But before we get to that, we have to talk about his legacy in film, which is, frankly, it's incalculable.
Campbell truly became Hollywood's indispensable muse. I mean, George Lucas was the first major filmmaker to credit his influence.
Right after the 1977 release of the first Star Wars film,
Lucas stated that the story was consciously shaped by ideas found in the hero with 1,000 faces.
that connection was so powerful it became self-reinforcing. Later reprints of Campbell's book literally had Luke Skywalker on the cover.
Yeah. Lucas admitted that when he was reading the book, he had this eerie realization that his initial rough draft of Star Wars was already following these classic mythological motifs. So he modified his subsequent drafts to make that pattern even more consistent and explicit.
It wasn't until the original trilogy was complete in 1983 that Lucas and Campbell actually met. Right.
Right. Lucas invited Campbell to Skywalker Ranch to watch the entire trilogy. Campbell's reaction was effusive. He called the films real art, recognizing their power to communicate universal mythological truth to a mass audience in a modern way.
And the influence just explodes from there. There was a screenwriter at Disney, Christopher Vogler,
Who distilled Campbell's work into a famous 7-page company memo, a practical guide to the hero with 1,000 faces.
which was used explicitly to structure Disney's 1994 animated blockbuster, The Lion King.
And once you have the key, you see the monomyth everywhere. The Matrix series with Neo's Journey, Batman films, Indiana Jones.
Even modern television writers, like Dan Harmon, the creator of Community and Rick and Morty, rely so heavily on Campbell's framework. He uses a specific structured story circle based on the hero's journey to formulate every single story.
His influence crossed into traditional literature as well. The novelist Richard Adams acknowledged Campbell's influence on Watership Down.
He even used excerpts from the hero with 1,000 faces as chapter epigrams.
And Dan Brown, who certainly reached a massive popular audience, cited Campbell's works, particularly The Power of Myth, as the inspiration for his character, Robert Langdon.
But the true explosion of popular recognition, what cemented his status as a global cultural phenomenon, was The Power of Myth.
The 1988 PBS series, those intimate, engaging interviews between Campbell and journalist Bill Moyers, broadcast 6 months after Campbell's death.
Moyers allowed Campbell to translate his dense academic theories into this accessible, deeply personal philosophical guidance. The book, with the expanded transcripts, was a bestseller for years.
And that series is where his most iconic and arguably most misunderstood maxim resonated with the entire American public.
Follow your bliss.
That's the one. It's a phrase that sounds so distinctly modern, almost like self-help or hedonism.
It does, but it has these profound ancient roots, tying directly back to his years of self-study and his immersion in Indology.
Campbell derived it from the Hindu Upanishads, which describe 3 fundamental terms representing the ocean of transcendence.
So what exactly is bliss here, given it's rooted in ancient Sanskrit, not modern self-help?
The 3 terms are Sat, meaning absolute being, Chit, meaning consciousness, and Ananda, meaning bliss or rapture. The 3 are inseparable. They describe the ultimate reality of the universe. Campbell just focused on Ananda.
He focused on rapture as the guide, the entry point.
Exactly. As he explained to Moyers, he wasn't certain if his consciousness or being was proper, but he knew where his rapture was. He believed that if he held on to Ananda, that intense rapture or joy, it would inherently lead him to his truer consciousness and his truer existence.
He saw this as the practical guide for the individual hero's journey through modern life. He famously said, "If you follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you."
And that the life you ought to be living is the one you are living.
It's a message that resonated so deeply with the American emphasis on individualism and self-actualization.
It did. It offered a spiritual framework for personal success that felt deeply ancient, yet completely modern.
However, because the American public, as Campbell often cautioned, tends to take the spiritual metaphor a bit literally,
Right.
the phrase began to be interpreted by some as just encouraging pure hedonism or instant gratification.
Which leads to the famous punchline that provides the necessary self-correction to the maxim.
I love this part.
Concerned about this misunderstanding, Campbell is reported to have grumbled later in life, "I should have said, follow your blisters."
A truly fantastic piece of cautionary advice, reminding us that the hero's journey is not a path of easy pleasure, but one of intense spiritual and psychological rigor, requiring hard work and sacrifice. The bliss is the reward, not the starting point.
Exactly.
The widespread popularity of Campbell, particularly after The Power of Myth, stands in, well, sharp contrast to the reaction he received from academic specialists in mythology, folklore, and anthropology.
It's a huge contrast.
So we need to introduce the fact that despite his fame, he faced significant, often severe, criticism.
This tension is absolutely critical to understanding his entire legacy. Campbell was a synthesizer, working across disciplines, but specialists argued that his broad synthesis often compromised rigor and precision for the sake of grand pattern-making.
The core critiques often came from folkloristics, where scholars like Bar Tolkien argued that Campbell constructed the monomyth using significant selection bias.
Tolkien's argument was that Campbell, in his desire to prove the universality of the monomyth, cited only those stories that perfectly fit his preconceived mold,
while conveniently setting aside equally valid stories and traditions that did not conform to the pattern.
Right, and in the eyes of folklorists, that kind of methodology undermines the integrity of the data.
I can see why that's a problem for specialists. Folklorists focus on the nuances of local culture, the specific language, the specific details. By stripping away those folk ideas to find the elementary ideas, Campbell seemed to be ignoring the very data that distinguished one culture from another.
Exactly. And the criticism escalated with Alan Dundas, a highly influential folklorist. Dundas was outright hostile, going so far as to designate Campbell as a non-expert in the field of folklore study.
That's strong language.
Dundas said there was no single idea promulgated by amateurs that has done more harm to serious folklore study than the notion of archetype.
Wow.
This highlights the deep professional rift. The scholar who focuses on localized, nuanced data versus the synthesizer who searches for global unifying patterns. Dundas viewed Campbell's work as essentially popular philosophy masquerading as serious scholarship.
And it seems like that generalization issue was mirrored in anthropology. Raymond Skupin noted that Campbell's theories were simply not well received in anthropology,
due to his overgeneralizations and other methodological problems. If you're an anthropologist focused on fieldwork and cultural specificity, Campbell's assertion that all myths are just masks for the same truth can feel like an erasure of the cultural labor and unique history of the people you study.
and his linguistic expertise, specifically in Sanskrit, came under direct fire.
Yes, from Geoffrey Moussaieff Masson, a former Sanskrit professor who was extremely critical.
What was his claim?
Masson claimed that Campbell had only the most superficial knowledge of India, and went so far as to accuse him of simply lying about his understanding of Sanskrit verses he quoted.
That is a very serious charge. It directly impugns his scholarly honesty.
It does, although it's only fair to present the counterpoint from the sources. Campbell did work closely with several recognized scholars who did translate Sanskrit, suggesting he relied on professional, authenticated translations rather than attempting personal fluency in every ancient language he cited.
There were also more general criticisms about his style and thematic reach.
Robert Elwood, a scholar of religion, noted that Campbell's multi-volume series, The Masks of God, impressed literate laity more than specialists, and he expressed concern about Campbell's oversimplification of historical matters and tendency to make myth mean whatever he wanted it to mean.
This idea that the pattern always fit because he chose the pieces that fit was a recurrent theme.
A very recurrent theme.
And finally, we must neutrally address the serious controversy regarding accusations of prejudice.
Right. Following his death, allegations of anti-Semitism and prejudice against blacks were raised by authors like Brendan Gill and Geoffrey Masson. The sources record that Tamar Frankiel noted Campbell called Judaism the Yahweh cult and spoke of it in almost exclusively negative terms in his lectures.
Comparing it unfavorably to other myth systems.
Yes. And while Robert Elwood noted that Gill relied primarily on scraps of evidence, largely anecdotal, Mizone also accused Campbell of hidden anti-Semitism. We present these as criticisms recorded in the source material, demonstrating that his intellectual legacy remains fiercely debated and complex, especially when judged by modern standards of cultural sensitivity.
To wrap up this extensive deep dive, we've really taken the full journey into Joseph Campbell's universe. We've seen how his immense intellectual effort, that 5 years of rigorous 9-hour-a-day reading, created the foundation for his entire comparative approach.
He managed to structure the entire body of human narrative, identifying the monomyth as the core pattern of the hero's journey, defining the 4 essential functions myth serves in society, and demonstrating the evolution of mythology through those 4 great ways.
His most crucial contribution, I think, was elevating myth from dusty history to vital, living metaphor. By insisting that myths were psychological guideposts and not literal facts, he made the universal patterns he identified intelligible and immediately applicable to modern life.
And that psychological and literary utility is exactly why he connected so deeply with creative artists and the general public. It led to the phenomenon of Star Wars, the ubiquity of his story structure, and that widespread mantra, "Follow your bliss."
And this brings us back to the fundamental tension that defined his entire career. The struggle between the universal pattern and the localized particular truth. His legacy endures because he connected millions of people to the deep structures of storytelling that resonate within the human psyche.
Yet the academic critique against overgeneralization and selection bias remains valid. Specialists argue that by synthesizing so broadly, he lost the localized particular truths that define individual cultures and histories.
So we want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If myth is truly a psychological roadmap designed to help guide the individual through life's inevitable suffering and challenges, the blissners, as he called them, how do you, the listener, decide which roadmap is most honest? Is it the universal story that speaks to the shared human condition? Or is it the localized particular truth that honors the original cultural context? Which one provides the most power for navigating your own journey? Think about that.